Matthews2 on Twitter. Today, we're joined by United States Senator from New Jersey, Cory Booker, and the co-executive director of the Action Center on Race and the Economy, Maurice B.P. Weeks. We'll be discussing the ways that racial wealth inequity inequality is increasing, including recent failures of government to provide equitable relief in light of the pandemic, and what legislation is out there that can start to turn the tide on the racial wealth gap. Experts have warned that the racial wealth gap between white and Black Americans has grown. Since the 1960s civil rights movement that sought to eliminate housing and employment discrimination, the overall wealth gap between Black and white Americans has stayed the same and has gotten even worse in particular areas. Specifically, the gap between Black and white homeownership, for example, has grown since the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. The pandemic has exacerbated these problems. Renters are devastated by lost wages and the slowed down economy, as nearly half of renters struggle to pay rent. And Black and Latinx families are disproportionately likely to be extremely low income renters. Children today are, for the first time in decades, less likely to earn more money than their parents. And with the pandemic shutting down schools across the country, many kids are losing access to education, one of the main vehicles they have to rise above the systemic inequality they were born into. At a time when childhood development resources should be expanding, kids are seeing less and less investment while receiving fewer and fewer opportunities. Recent legislation seeks to address the race and age wealth gap. Senator Booker and Representative Ayanna Pressley reintroduced the American Opportunity Accounts Act, which would mean every baby born in the United States gets a guaranteed cash investment of $50,000 from the United States government when they turn 18, a program also known as baby bonds. Just a few days ago, key Democrats, including Senator Booker, proposed the Federal Reserve Racial and Economic Equity Act. That bill would require the Fed to take action to minimize and eliminate racial disparities in employment, wages, wealth, and access to affordable credit. And both parties are considering a second direct payment in the next stimulus package that is currently being negotiated. Proponents say that these and other programs could reduce the race and generational wealth gaps and provide much needed pandemic relief. Our guests today are here to discuss why this kind of congressional action is so important. Cory, let's start with you. Great to have you back on the briefing. You've talked about baby bonds in recent weeks as a part of the response to the pandemic. What are baby bonds, and what is the connection between baby bonds and an equitable response to the pandemic?
Well, so baby bonds should be one tool within a larger toolbox of racial equity in this country, and what it would try to impact this racial wealth gap that you spelled out, with the average African-American having about 1/10 the wealth of the average white American. And baby bonds is a powerful tool because it really plays on this understanding that most Americans don't fully grasp, that we already use our tax code to shift every year through tax expenditures about $600 to $700 billion by helping wealthy people, give them tax breaks to build even more wealth. So we already use the federal government to build more wealth. And one of the most commonly known ones of those is the mortgage interest deduction. If you have the money to buy a house, we'll give you a tax expenditure. Now that is actually wildly used by the majority of that's used by the top 10% of the earners in the country. And so this is an idea that, hey, paychecks just help you get by, but wealth is what helps you get ahead. It's what helps you build generational wealth. It's what insulates you during times. And so this is just a powerful idea of a way to use our tax code to help seed wealth more equally throughout our country. And so every child born would get a savings account of sorts that we have $1,000 put in every year. You would get up to $2,000 in your account. The lowest income kids, the 1 out of every 5 or 6 children in our country that's poor, by the time that they're 18, because of the laws of compound interest, would have about $50,000. The average child overall would have about 15. The average Black child would actually have more than $20,000. And that's actually could be used then to do things that do create generational wealth: college education, a house, starting a business. And so when it was analyzed by Columbia University, they said it virtually collapses the racial wealth gap amongst young people starting out in their life. And it's one important step that we can begin to do, not only to create more wealth equally distributed in this country, but to address these structural and sort of racial disparities that we have in our country.
So I'd like to talk a little bit more about that step. So you introduced the American Opportunities Accounts Act, and you discussed baby bonds in your run for the Democratic presidential nomination. The recent Biden-Sanders Economic Task Force recommended that Joe Biden seriously examine baby bonds. Do you know where Joe Biden stands on this? And does he back the program? And have you had any discussions with him about baby bonds specifically?
The first discussion I had with him actually was during a debate. He pulled me aside backstage and said he loved the proposal. It was really exciting and something he really wanted to look at. And so I know his team is aware of it and are interested in it. And this is also what I know is that they are probably more motivated than I've seen any presidency of the presidents I've had a chance to interact with in my life, more determined to deal with these deep structural racial inequalities. And so knowing that it came out of that sort of committee that they put together with the progressives in our campaign, they pulled together a lot of great thinkers and leaders, that it was one of the proposals that landed on their agenda, gives me a lot of hope that this could be something that we could possibly get done. And I'm excited because more and more senators are joining me as co-sponsors of this legislation.
I'd like to talk about another tool that you've brought up previously. You were recently part of a group of senators who proposed legislation that would mandate the Federal Reserve take action to end wealth disparities. This would be the first major change to the Fed's mandate since 1977. What would that new mandate mean, and what kind of actions do you see the Fed taking under that new mandate?
Well, look, the Fed mission, and remember, right now we're seeing it in this downturn, they're putting hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars into our economy. But there's ways that they can do it that can really help to create more equity, more inclusion, and more fairness. And so reducing inequality should be a part of the Fed's mission. Their mission should not be to protect stock market gains simply or help Wall Street make more money. Remember, even some conservative voices talk about the fetishization of the markets, which really what they should be doing. The ideals behind capitalism, if you don't just read Adam Smith's Invisible Hand, but read his essays on moral sentiments and moral obligations, it should be to create the more equitable distribution of wealth and opportunity. And so the Fed should have it part of their mission. Another thing that we're saying in this bill is that legislation requires the Federal Reserve the Federal Reserve Chair, to identify clearly in their semi-annual testimony before Congress, one, to speak to the existing disparities in employment and income and wealth across racial and ethnic lines, and two, to talk to how the Fed is using its many authorities to reduce those disparities. And finally, as I found out back when I was managing the city of Newark, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And that's why this legislation just requires robust reporting on disparities in labor force trends, requiring the Fed's semi-annual monetary policy report and that the Fed has to release in conjunction with the overall trends that they put out about trends in the labor force that they put out. And so this is really important to start creating some more accountability amongst what is really the institution that most controls or affects a lot of our monetary policy in the United States.
Now, Corey, folks are experiencing a lot, right? And there's so many issues that are impacting our communities. Why should people be paying attention to this in particular?
Well, I just want to say that's why I said these are not the only things that we should be fighting for, because we know when prescription drugs are too high or you don't have access to health insurance, people go bankrupt, and we disproportionately see African Americans not having access to health care and to affordable drugs. That is a wealth issue. We know that education in this country is still, as Jonathan Kozol would say, we still see savage inequalities along racial lines in the United States of America. That is directly connected to wealth and wealth opportunities. And so there's a lot of things that we need to be focused on. But these are actually really good points of leverage that we can do to start leveling the playing field. And I'm hoping, in fact, I've seen how baby bonds, this idea is catching more and more enthusiasm and attention. But we cannot begin to fall into the idea that this is these issues of racial disparities is going to be solved by flipping one switch, or even solved with government alone. I've had a lot of conversations during this pandemic with just decisions that corporations are making, decisions that state governments are making. And here down in Washington, I continue to see, here's when it comes to contracting in the federal government, the Trump administration using this pandemic to go around the minority business programs that are there. I see one of the greatest wealth creators there are managing pensions. Well, New York to Texas, they have their state pensions. They have minority managers. Here in the biggest pensions, perhaps on the planet Earth, the ones controlled by the federal government, there's no minority managers. This is how extraordinary wealth is created. And so as a senator, I want to call it all out, figure out what the federal levels are, but most importantly, for us to be having this conversation nationally, driving this conversation so that we can start elevating consciousness in this country, so that it's on the front of the agenda for anyone in power, whether it's in a boardroom, in the halls of Congress, or in local government.
Thank you, Senator. Maurice, I'd like to turn to you. So you're a community organizer, and your organization has done a ton to advance racial and economic equality. How would action by the Fed support the work you are doing right now?
Sure, and thanks for having me, John. It's great to be with a fellow New Yorker, Senator Booker. So look, the needs that the communities that my organization works with, they were intense before the pandemic, and they've only been exacerbated now. And the reason to us is really simple. We have an economic and political system where a small group of people, and these are wealthy folks, mostly white, mostly male, use their money to wield both economic dominance and political power at the same time. So what do I mean by economic dominance? Well, you can just look at the nature of our economy right now. So, I like to say, and I take this from our friends at Groundwork Collaborative, that we are the economy. So if there's a group of folks who aren't doing well, then the economy is not doing well. If Black women aren't doing well, if Black trans women aren't doing well, the economy is not doing well. But the stock market right now, when you look at that, it's shooting way and way up, right? S&P 500 companies continue to increase their value. Jeff Bezos himself has had several days this year where he's added several $billion to his wealth. 467 billionaires saw their wealth increase by almost $1 trillion in the last few months. So that is economic dominance, a group of people who are spiraling while all the wealth that they create is funneling up into the hands of just a few other people. So of course we need checks to stop this, and that's where our elected officials come in, who are supposed to stand up for us, control the rules of the game so one group doesn't dominate. But that's where the political side of this comes in. So we have a money and politics system where lots of elected officials are reliant on these same corporations, these same forces to run their campaign. And Citizens United is an example of something that just has made that way worse. So, folks who are reliant on things like real estate and big banks and private equity and big pharma, they can't properly represent us. I can go in and lobby in Congress until my throat dries up, and I do sometimes. And if someone from Pfizer comes in right after me, like I'm not a fool. I know who's going to be listened to. I just have a couple negative $100,000 in student debt. Pfizer made $48 billion last year, so I know the game. The situation right now is life or death, though. So we need folks to step up to the plate. And that's not just because we have a deadly pandemic, which a report that Acre is releasing next week will highlight that the monopoly power of big pharma is literally leading to more Black people dying from the coronavirus. But also, we're about to see an eviction crisis of epic proportions. We're facing a climate crisis of epic proportions. We're facing a food security crisis of epic proportions, labor crisis. We need solutions fast. So I really love the proposal that the senator is behind and was co-developed by a great colleague of mine and friend, Professor Hamilton. The Federal Reserve is the people's bank, and we have the ability to really make sure that it serves us in guaranteeing some sort of wealth stability for people who are living in this country through a program like baby bonds. But also, as the senator said, this can't be the only thing. Education isn't destiny. Otherwise, the Black college grads wouldn't be making less than white high school graduates, which is the status that we're in right now. So there's a lot more we can do. and a lot more the Fed can do, really. You know, we only worry about Fed deficits when we're talking about helping poor and working class people. But, you know, if it's to start another war somewhere or to buy a new fancy helicopter, we don't care about it. Well, it's time to turn that on its head and think about all of the other things that go along with baby bonds that create the ability for folks to build wealth and thrive. So that's free college, that's free medicines, Medicare for all, a jobs guarantee, a homes guarantee. These are things that the Federal Reserve can really help us with, providing to everyone who lives in this country. And I think if we do that, if we take a holistic approach, while at the same time dismantling the power that the wealthy and corporations have through both taxation and our legal avenues, then I think we can start to close this racial wealth gap and have a fully functioning and thriving country.
Thanks, Maurice. So, you know, I love that you did a show with your sister. I'd love to do a show with my sister. I think she would probably respectfully decline, but I'm going to ask her anyway. In that show, you know, you discussed big pharma. I'd like to ask you to expand a little bit more on this idea of like how the pandemic has increased the urgency of these issues. Like, why is this moment a perfect storm, and you know what needs to happen?
Sure, yeah. And my sister, I always like to joke that I'm the dumb one in the family. My sister is an MD, PhD, and she works in the Harvard medical system and you know, works on hematology, but has a wide range of knowledge in things like infectious diseases and other things. Another proud Newark Public School product there. So. You know, one thing that we talked about, which, as I mentioned, ACRE is going to be releasing a report about next week, is, you know, pharmaceutical companies are really given legal monopolies in our economy and in our country, and that means that, you know, we develop everything that goes behind a medication, and that might be developed with public funds. It might even be developed at a public university. And then to manufacture it and to finish the process, we hand that science over to a company that then decides to charge a certain amount for it. And they're locked in as the only folks who can make that medicine for a certain period of time. So what does this look like? This is, folks will remember the pharma bro, Martin Shkreli, who just arbitrarily hiked up the price of a medication that people literally needed to survive by hundreds of %. This means insulin. We remember a few years ago when folks were talking about the price of insulin doubling overnight. All of these things are things that really, you know, goes to the power that corporations have during this time. And, you know, one of the things that, especially as a Black person who's concerned with health, we all should be focused on is there are lots of comorbidities with the coronavirus that Black folks have, that they need medications that are spiraling, whose costs are spiraling out of control. So, you know, I've talked to people who skip their heart medications every other day to make sure that they last because they're so expensive, don't take their full insulin, or maybe don't take it at all, and various things like that. We know that both of those things in particular, diabetes and heart disease, if you get the coronavirus and you're under treatment for one of those, you're already at risk. Think of how much more you're at risk if you're not even able to afford and take the full treatment that you're supposed to. So I think, you know, this and then at the same time, our federal government is giving even more money to corporations in order to have them do more science to find these drugs. When you know, what we should be doing is guaranteeing that whenever a vaccine or any treatment, or really any medicine that's used to treat a comorbidity, is guaranteed for free, so that we can actually tamp down and stop this virus. So yeah, this pandemic really just makes all of the things I'm talking about, it just multiplies them really exponentially.
Thanks so much. And thanks to you both for joining us again. So the Institute for Policy Studies recently produced a report calling for 8 interventions that would combat white supremacy and the racial wealth gap, including baby bonds and guaranteed income in its recommendations. The report found that the Black and Latinx families are twice as likely to have zero wealth. The combined wealth of the top 70 US billionaires equaled the entire home equity wealth of all Black and Latinx families combined before the pandemic. The numbers may now be even more disparate. Corey, just this morning, Donald Trump brought up your name when he doubled down on his attack on the Obama-Biden administration's efforts to address housing inequality. Trump's administration has attacked Obama-Biden era rules enforcing Fair Housing Act requirements that the government and partners proactively further equitable housing access. What do you have to say in response to Donald Trump and him calling you, specifically calling you out this morning?
Well, look, his racism was shown again, and it's like he is not the focus right now. This election is not a referendum on him. It's a referendum on us and who we are and who we're going to be to each other. And frankly, beating him is not enough. It may get us out of a valley, but it doesn't get us to the mountaintop, because the great old days of 2015 were not times I want to see. Maurice was just laying it plain. I mean, we live in this absurdity. Canada's not like South Korea, New Zealand, Germany. They don't have a world where people have to ration their insulin and end up in diabetic shock in the emergency room, disproportionately affecting communities of color. They don't have a reality where people can't afford their inhalers. I mean, the absurdity of what we've learned to tolerate, what Americans call normal, that there are literally millions of children at risk of drinking lead-laden water, disproportionately African Americans. The color of your skin is the biggest determinant of whether you will be poisoned by the world around you, and it has a real economic effect. There is a real economic effect to mass incarceration, with Villanova saying that we'd have 20% less poverty in America if we had incarceration rates that were the same as our industrial peers. And those are disproportionately heaped upon communities like Maurice is in right now and I'm in right now, Detroit and Newark, where I took a camera crew around here once when I was mayor. I live in the central ward of Newark, and just stopped black men and said, "Hey man, have you ever been arrested?" And we didn't find one person that hadn't, but they were doing the same things that people at the schools of Stanford and Yale that I went to were doing, but they have a different justice system. And so Donald Trump is not my obsession right now. I'm sorry, it's not. When King wrote the letters from the Birmingham jail, he explicitly said, I'm not writing to white racists. He said, the White Citizens Council, KKK. No, I'm writing to moderates, white moderates, he said specifically, that are not doing anything, that are become comfortable, adjusted to the injustice in our country. And so that's the moment we're at. Will this be a real awakening where suddenly we recognize how just not only unjust as it is in terms of the American perspective of black versus white, but I'm talking about how unjust it is in the international perspective, where as a guy on the Foreign Relations Committee, I sometimes have leaders in other countries say to me, wait a minute, you don't have affordable childcare? You don't have paid family leave? I mean, these are things that are fundamental that other countries don't heap that anxiety and worry and economic crisis. And so the pandemic, as Maurice said, a guy I just love in every way except for his hair, I'm just jealous. Damn, man, you're almost two of us. Can't you just shave it down for me today? But the reality is that, everything we're talking about is not a radical concept to think that we could address these things. We have the power and the capability. And this is the trick. It'll make everyone better off. There's a study that just came out, I think it was MIT, that just talked about access to capital. Black entrepreneurs who are denied equal access to capital. We know this from the PPP loans, where they just did a study where people walked in, same business, they gave them all the same paperwork. And the experiences of the black person walking in the bank and the white person were radically different. If blacks had the same access to capital, our whole economy would grow by $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. And so this is the most, it is not only the deep unaddressed wound of our society going back to our founding, but it is affecting the whole body politic. And to deal with these racial injustices actually would help us all thrive better and better compete against the real threats globally right now. And I see the intelligence reports of adversarial countries that are trying to undermine, if not destroy, our democracy.
No, thank you for saying that. Even McKinsey recognizes that closing the racial wealth gap would add money to the economy. McKinsey estimates, as you said, the economy is losing to the racial wealth gap, $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion over the next decade. Maurice, I'd like to bring you in and talk about, you talk about how race needs to be centered in this conversation. And, Senator Booker was talking about how, the concern really is about not this kind of very in your face racism, but all the folks that are like just kind of adjusted to injustice, right? So how are you breaking through with your organizing and kind of bridging the gap?
Yeah. No, I think that Trump's tweets that targeted the senator, they're really trying to tap into exactly that. These folks who have gotten comfortable, in really in their whiteness and in their own wealth. One of the most insidious things that I think this administration has done is really rescinding the AFFH rule, which is what he's referring to when he so crudely tweets about it. And for folks who don't know, that was a rule that was put in place that finally gave some teeth to the Fair Housing Act of 1968. This wasn't some radical Obama thing. This is literally the law that passed after Dr. King was assassinated. And it finally gave teeth to that. And, really, I think through our political education, one of the things that we try and do is really explain the history of housing to folks. And, you might think that everything is equal now. But there was a long period of time in this country, really since its founding all the way up until 1968, where someone like me couldn't buy a house in lots of different neighborhoods, and it's still hard even after 1968. So if I wasn't able to buy a house, I wasn't able to send my kids to college using that. I wasn't able to deal with an unexpected medical expense. I wasn't able to fix my roof if something happened. I wasn't able to tap into all of that wealth. So really what we need is government solutions that really focus on the harm that has been done by hundreds of years of both government and corporate policy. And that really is getting to reparations, and reparations in not just housing, but education, jobs, direct payments to individuals, and much, much more.
I just want to add to, because Maurice and I are brothers in Newark, but he grew up in the city. I did not. In 1969, my parents were moving from Washington, D.C., where the activism of the Urban League and others got my dad became the first Black salesman hired in IBM in that region. Comes up to New Jersey and tries to move into areas with the highest rated public schools. And every time they would show up, this is 69, they would get turned away. And so my parents literally worked with the Fair Housing Council to get a white couple to pose as them. And the white couples who would volunteer would follow my parents around. When they were told houses were sold, they would go and find out if they were really for sale. On the house that I grew up in, my parents were turned away. A white couple put a bid on the house. On the day of the closing, my dad shows up with a lawyer, and then it still isn't enough. The real estate agent gets up and punches my dad's lawyer in the face, sigs a dog on my dad. And so when you look at Newark, for example, this is not a pocket of poverty because people just wanted to live and associate together. This was a city that was redlined, where other communities would not let affordable housing, and they dumped it in here. They devalued the land. They literally, as in the time that Maurice was going to school, because I know some peers of his, there's a wonderful woman named Barbara Martinez, that people in Newark would often use fake addresses in other school systems and they would have people that would literally follow around children to see where they go home, particularly minority children, and then remove them from school. So these were communities that were not physically walled off, but in so many ways they were. And we need to own up to this history that deeply affects the present. There's no way we can escape our present realities unless we confront our past and address them in our policies. But yet we are not doing that. And not only are we not doing that, if you look at things like the president's most recent tax scam, where he passed this major tax bill that shifted even more wealth out of our common treasury, cost $1 trillion of deficits, new deficits. And who benefited from that? Disproportionately white folks, but disproportionately the wealthiest of wealthy folks. And so we are using public policy not to heal, but to exaggerate current divisions. And the only way we can change that is with conscious policies that are seeking to address these savage inequalities and disparities in our country. And the solutions are not, don't think that I already hear how they're talking about my sister Kamala. They are not radical ideas that our competitive countries are all doing them. There are things that we know, $1 invested in preschool returns multiples back in universal preschool. We live in a country where most states, the cost of childcare is more expensive than tuition at your state college. Other countries know that investing in childcare produces massive dividends. Let me give you another example, this punitive retribution system of incarceration we have. When they stripped away Pell Grants from incarcerated individuals, they literally cost taxpayer money, because when you give people access to education in prison, their recidivism rates go way down. And so we are being penny wise and pound foolish. In fact, that metaphor doesn't work. We are giving away our pennies to the wealthiest and causing great harm to the nation as a whole, and while plunging more people into the traps of poverty. And so I know I have to go. And John, that last rant, I'm sorry, man. I'm just you're trying to do an interview.
I wasn't going to talk. Hey, I wasn't going to stop you.
No, I'm grateful.
All the energy
This is the Bald Head Alliance. You see
right?
how it works, America? You see?
It is. But I just want to make that last point again that I did, because I want to remind us that this conversation amongst us and people that might be tuning in is not enough. We have to get the people that are not, I'm not trying to convince Donald Trump or Mitch McConnell. I know who they are, and they show us who they are. The real inspiration here is to try to get folks more aware of this crisis, and that they have a responsibility, not just to look at it with anguish, but to join the activism that has always been necessary to produce the changes we desire. As Frederick Douglass has always said, without struggle, there is no progress. We need more people to join the struggle.
Amen. Absolutely.
Thank you.
No, thanks so much, Corey, Maurice. Appreciate your all's time. I know you have to run. I appreciate you both for keeping it so real. Both my parents had similar housing experience in South Central LA, where you just couldn't buy property on the west side. Like, you just couldn't, and it has real effects on both your life chances and wealth and access to power. So appreciate y'all. Please tune in tomorrow. Josie will be hosting a show on how Chicago plans to divest from policing and invest in community. Please be safe, be healthy, and be empowered.